M. The Media Project. E for All and E para Todos are focused on entrepreneurs who are building our cities and towns one neighborhood at a time. And E for All needs you. Become a mentor, enlist as an entrepreneur, or work to bring an E for All program to your community.
I'm M the Media Project founder, Scott M. Graves, and I'm an E for All mentor. Believe me when I say you already have everything you need to be an entrepreneur. By working with E for All, you will garner the skills, the connections, and the confidence to see your business to success.
Don't think you're ready to be an E for All mentor? Think again. Your business community needs you to step up and contribute in a highly dynamic and meaningful way. Learn more today at eforall.org.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another SMG's Are We Here Yet podcast. Tonight, I have Dominic Endicott in the virtual studio. Dominic believes that we can redraw our maps for the 21st century. He has a vision for how knowledge-based ecosystems can create the proliferation of entrepreneurship, jobs, real estate, and services in demand for a wider spectrum of rural and urban communities. He's here with us today to talk about his vision as expressed in knowledge towns, colleges and universities as talent magnets, which he co-authored this year with David J. Staley of The Ohio State University. Dominic is a partner at NorthStar Ventures and an advisor at the Met Fund. Dominic, thank you for taking the time and joining us here on the Are We Here Yet podcast.
Hello. Very pleased to be here.
Absolutely love the book. Really
Thank you.
Feel like in many ways we're kindred spirits after having read the book myself. I'd love for you to talk, maybe start out by talking about this idea of the new playbook as you outline. And I just want to point out to our listeners, I think it exemplifies what so many of us working in ecosystem building understand, but a lot of just regular citizens maybe don't, and that is that paradigm shift between thinking in terms of and as opposed to either or. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that.
Yeah, I think that implicitly we have a number of trade-offs that hold us back. For example, we think I can have place that's very efficient, but then I'll have to have high-speed roads everywhere because people have to get from A to B, and I'll sort of sacrifice my quality of life, and maybe I'll risk my children for the sake of efficiency. But in reality, that's wrong. If you design a place that's accommodating for people to be able to walk safely, it turns out that generates a lot of economic growth. You're not going to lose that much time in traffic because most trips are actually quite short. So, you may save a minute or two over the course of the day, but actually that causes huge economic inefficiencies, right? So I think that we have this sort of false sense of trade-offs. And so a lot of the way of thinking is that we need to redesign things to achieve simultaneously improvements in environmental conditions, in health conditions, but also in economic growth.
Yeah. And by the way, the Strong Towns folks would love you, right? For the analogy,
a long-time fan
to roads, right? Yeah.
Yes.
As am I. There's the book really encompasses just this wide variety of components that make up this really wonderful ecosystem as a whole. But is it fair to say that the sort of pinnacle or the central pivot point is education, right? Talk first about education's role.
It's education tied to knowledge and tied to talent. And I mean, one of the core insights is that our economy, the US economy, is very much driven by the technology economy. And that is extremely concentrated in a couple of clusters, which tend to be anchored around universities like Stanford in the West Coast or MIT and Harvard in the East Coast. And we've built these very powerful economic engines that ultimately emerge from the universities, right? So the university, I think, is this very, very interesting platform for growth in the US as well as globally. But it has tended to be very concentrated in a small number of cities. And yet we have 4,000 universities distributed across the land. And we could actually harness each of those universities into becoming effectively the center of a local economic engine. And that could provide us with a substantial amount of growth. And also it would be a more evenly distributed growth, because one of the challenges in the US is, even though our wealth, our average wealth has grown quite nicely over the last decades, our median wealth has not. So we actually a very poor country on a median basis, even though we're very rich on an average basis. And I think part of that has to do with the very tight geographical concentration of wealth creation in a couple of key locations. The big idea is, if we could distribute that more evenly across the country, we wouldn't take anything away from those places that are very successful. We would just be adding a lot more of those locations.
The central theme here, correct me if I'm wrong, is the decentralization of this key facet of society, right?
Yes.
Talk about some of the practicalities as you see them for actually gain, because this is really about access. It's about access to education, but not necessarily access for more people conveniently placed where they are to get a 4-year degree in the traditional sense, correct?
Yes, I mean, I think there are sort of simultaneously happening a whole bunch of changes. One is that the notion of whether going to college is still a good idea is under significant stress, right? I think the last survey suggested about 55% of parents don't think sending their kids to college is a good idea. And that was maybe 45% a decade ago. And so I think a lot of people are wondering whether the 4-year model is really still the best model. At the same time, universities have a huge opportunity to serve markets that they haven't gone after historically. So for example, if you think about empty nesters, 50-somethings that may still want to work or need to work for another 15, 20 years, and may need to fundamentally reskill themselves, actually going back to a university, maybe their alma mater, potentially even selling their home and moving back there and restarting their career is a good idea and a new market for the universities. Universities are also sitting on potentially very interesting pieces of land. They have a lot of assets they could be leveraging. They have intellectual property. They have very smart people. They have great networks. They have alumni. So they have all these assets that could be harnessed in this new normal. And as you said, one of the key changes in the game is that remote work is now effectively the default model for many of the most productive people in America. It's something that used to be sort of a niche and is now mainstream. And that really is a change in the geography of work, right? Work used to be in the office. As work moves away from the office, and it can be essentially anywhere, that scrambles the geography and it creates all sorts of opportunities for secondary and tertiary cities.
Yeah, and the two fascinating things there about space in relation to what you just said are, you look at rural environments like the one I'm currently in central Vermont, and the positive effects of that. Conversely, though, you can go to a relatively urban area. Let's take the 128 belt just outside of Boston and think about what that landscape could look like with, say 40% of that acreage under roof. That Class A office space is no longer needed. What does it become, right? For a city that used to feed itself with a beltway of farms immediately outside, as an example, or maybe it's living, more people living there or what have you. It's interesting. This has something to do with, I guess, is it referred to as modular education too, right?
Yeah, I mean, one way of thinking about it is that our society is a complex adaptive system. Cities are complex adaptive systems. Um, Most companies are those same kinds of systems. And in essence, therefore, in one of those systems, you can't really plan too much into the future because the reality is the world's changing all the time. And I think we're seeing the rate of change is accelerating, right? We're sort of hit by changes in direction and velocity that are coming at us all the time in almost every domain in which we live, and therefore our life is becoming more so. And so you effectively need a strategy where you don't quite know what's going to happen. You need to pick some sort of a direction, but then you need a system to be able to adapt very fast, right? In venture capital, the way that's done is that investors make a lot of very small seed investments, and then they see what happens with that. And then the companies that do well with that seed investment tend to get more money. And over time, they raise successive series of capital, but it's quite de-risked. So even though any individual company is very likely to actually not make it, as a system, that ends up very consistently producing amazing global changing companies. Cities should also operate a little bit like that. So instead of saying we're going to build this massive multi-million-dollar complex and we'll sort of build it all from scratch and we're going to control it, a more successful model is to say we don't quite know exactly what a city is going to need, so we're going to start building, and then we'll build some more, and then depending on what people want, we'll build some more, and then we'll tear some stuff down and we'll change use. So we're seeing that right now, that we made this massive bet that we're going to build all these tall towers in the central business districts. And then one day people said, well, we don't really want to go back to the office, and now we have this commercial real estate crisis because it's actually extremely hard to adapt most of those office buildings to alternative uses. So it's really the failure to understand that we're a complex adaptive system that sort of put us in trouble, and the solution is to go back to that. And that's something that we intuitively knew in the past, and we have, as a society, forgotten.
Another aspect on the education side that I really took away is a really great takeaway, rather, from the book, is you describe the bionic worker. And I think this also gets to this idea of taking technology itself and putting it in its proper context in society. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that concept of the bionic worker.
So the bionic idea came from a colleague of mine, John Zviokla, and I sort of, as we wrote this book, we adapted it into the book. And the idea is, it's sort of tied to the first principle, which is act local but harness the cloud. The bionic worker is both working kind of in the physical world, but is being enabled by all the available tools. And you're seeing that now in spades with ChatGPT and this notion of everybody having essentially a bot that's doing a lot of the work for them. And so it's really this sort of interaction between this sort of technological world that's out there that we want to harness all that information and make it work for us. But at the same time, we want to be able to apply our unique context and knowledge and judgment to solve real problems. And many of the best situations are collaborations between these chat bots and sort of smart, intelligent agents, and then the human that is doing the orchestration or the interpretation.
Yeah, it's leveraging technology, again, putting technology in its proper context. There's also the notion. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, and I guess just to add to that, right, there's a lot of ways in which technology is turning us into slaves of the technology. We feel like the algorithm is directing us. A countervailing idea is to say we want to put the algorithm to work for us rather than us work for them, and that means we have to design algorithms that are truly representing the individual rather than the collective. And that's really a shift in technology that hasn't really been seen.
And isn't that really ultimately a shift in thought and of human culture to embrace that idea? And what about the idea that, with so many concerned with the power of a technology like AI, what about the notion that if we flood the marketplace with positive uses and placing this technology in its many forms in the right context, we get positive results? If we leave a vacuum of opportunity to those that would use this technology for nefarious reasons, then our end result is we get an overabundance of bad uses of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's effectively two fundamental paths, right? You could say there's going to be more and more automation, and that means that without really having to get up and do work, lots of things will be created, and therefore I could just kind of be a bit of a vegetable and hang out and watch Netflix all day and order takeout food, and stuff will just happen and life will be kind of easy. And that is definitely one of the potential paths, right? The alternative path is to say, I, as an individual, want to pursue the highest level purpose to which I'm equipped, which is sort of effectively the intersection of what am I good at, what do I like to do, and what does society need, and maybe what will society reward me with. So if I could find the highest challenge that works for me, that tends to be a good thing to do. That's a path of purpose. Then you can say, well, in what ways could technology help me? So maybe it's going to help me take on a bigger challenge, because now I can use a series of tools that will do a lot of work for me and sort of allow me to then pursue this purpose in a kind of bigger way than I would otherwise. So, I mean, to some extent, I think you have to first throw away the technology or put it to the side and really think about, what do you as an individual want to do, where you can add the most value to the world, and start to sort of think about that path of purpose. But then very tactically, how do you harness all the best available tools to make you as effective as possible?
I think that approaches to this important notion that you write about, in order for us to I guess express that we've fully embraced the knowledge economy, we have to give priority to the imagination. You express in the book that we need to, I think, make a bigger priority for in this case, that would be, to me, on the hierarchy of the use of human time, right? That's where the creativity starts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one way I would think about it is that in the past, if you were, say, an artisan, and that was your job, it would involve a lot of inherent creativity. You were probably walking to your job maybe 30 minutes every day. In that walk, you would sort of get to exercise your right brain as you're sort of watching nature. Then you get to work. You're working on a creative enterprise. So our jobs gave us a lot of full brain workout, as it were, that was in balance. To some extent, our world, which has become so technologically driven, is extremely left brain oriented, and it's really put us out of balance. And therefore, we have to design compensating mechanisms to get back in balance. That's why going for a walk every day, going for a walk in nature, especially, to sort of reset yourself and really exercise the right brain, have a creative pursuit. All these things are not only nice to have, they're must have, because otherwise there is a risk that you'll be so overweighted in terms of these sort of intellectual and left brain activities that you will sort of lose your center of gravity. I mean, an analogy of this is how, when the first wave of industrialization came to the New England area, a lot of people realized, well, we need to send our kids to summer camp and let them spend the whole summer running around in nature, because otherwise they're going to become softer and somewhat limited in their experiences. And I think that was a good idea. That's why people still want to do it. And to some extent, I think we have to find those new kinds of rebalancing mechanisms.
It's the John Adams walking 10 miles a day
Yes,
before and after he writes, right? It's like
exactly.
a wonderful
Exactly.
example. Yeah.
And the nice thing is now today we can actually do brain scans and we can look at what is the effect and what is your brain doing, when you spend 3 hours watching videos or when you spend 4 hours sitting versus when you're walking, right? So we actually have a lot of evidence that your brain is working in fundamentally different ways, as well as we have the evidence that when we do those kinds of things, we come back and our creativity is tenfold, right? So I think we to some extent need to go back and look at our history and all this embedded knowledge from the past and recover that, because in many ways we presume too much in our modern society that we think we're so advanced that we know everything, and we've forgotten a lot of these rules that our predecessors kind of knew instinctively.
I think a similar case to that, and we have plenty of evidence having measured brain activity, is a very enriched and active involvement in the arts. And we've just made it so difficult for vast swaths of the population to really be able to embrace spending real meaningful time expressing yourself through some kind of artistic medium. But the benefits to that, if you can't bring yourself to do that for your personal humanity, there's something to be said for allowing it, for the very pragmatic reasons of in this new economy that we'd like to see more people involved in and seeking benefit from, that it's going to be important that you really flex those intellectual muscles.
So one of the things that I think about at a practical level is great. So these are all good ideas, but there's probably a reason why a lot of people are not able to practice arts, have this balanced lifestyle, walk enough every day. We don't walk enough. We don't exercise. We don't have enough joy. We don't have enough community. And if we look back and we say, well, what's the reason for that? Ultimately, the enemy is the sprawl model that we designed and implemented the last 80 to 100 years. That there are many other contributors, but that's probably the number one issue. And that's hard to change, both because physically it requires reinvestment and redoing things in very different ways, but also because we're so used to it that we've almost become prisoner to that model. And so part of what I'm thinking about is, okay, well, we have this new reset. We have remote first work. We have artificial intelligence. We now have this reindustrialization that's going on. We can also look at housing, and depending on the estimate, we need between 20 million and I would actually say up to 70 million new homes. We probably need to redo half the homes in the US because they're so old and so fully depreciated that you're almost better off starting from scratch. So given that that is going to be happening, can we ensure that we design places to actually deliver those results, to make them better for community, to make them better for art, to make them better for science, to make them more walkable, more bikeable, cleaner air? And what is the right model for that kind of community? How do you design it? Questions like, what is the level of density? What is the role of a university or something equivalent? It could be a museum, some sort of a knowledge enterprise in designing that. And so what I'm overall gravitating to is this idea of knowledge hamlets that can be these kind of packed, relatively dense communities. I'd almost call them micro-urban centers. They could be in many locations, not in traditional cities necessarily. They could be in cities, but they could also be in small towns, but that are explicitly designed to try and maximize all these things that are missing today.
There's a great segue, by the way, into a world we like to embrace a lot here on the show, which is, how we're designing and implementing our physical spaces. How much are concepts like the tax revenue per acre ratio and so forth? How much, if any, did that affect some of your personal ideas on that kind of streetscape?
I think that, to me, that's a very powerful set of ideas, thinking about what is the value per acre, what is the income per acre, the revenue per acre, and the cost per acre. And I learned a lot from groups like Urban 3, which have been doing some fascinating analyses and very shocking, right? Because what they show is that in almost every city in America, something like 80% of the land is loss making, and a small portion of that land is profit making. Traditionally, also in cities in America, many of the old parts of town that were dismissed by the people that wanted to change things were actually the most profitable. Many of these suburban sprawl developments actually lose money on a per acre basis. I think groups like Brookings have done some very interesting work. So people like Bruce Katz on thinking about value. And that's actually one of the big areas of research for me right now, is looking at what is the value of a place? How come we can value a company by looking at sort of the discounted cash flow into the future, and we can establish a valuation. We see if it's growing or shrinking, but we don't really talk about the value of a place. And I think that really misses on an opportunity. So I think that is a really interesting new area that we touched upon in the book, but I think there's a lot more to be done there.
Yeah, one of the things that you really fascinated me from the book related to housing is the different examples that you give for housing as a service. This is a new concept to many listeners, so I'm wondering if you can sort of give us a bit of a primer on that. You use as an example, you give it some real context on the ground. So for those of us that are from New England, the name Laconia, New Hampshire, I'd like you to speak to that.
So the evolution of this concept began with the notion of software as a service. So a lot of software went from you buy it once to you buy it on a monthly basis, and you sort of effectively paying for it as a service. Then that shifted into really everything as a service. And there's a great book called Subscribed, which talks about this sort of move to the subscription economy, where it's not just software, but it could be other kinds of things. And you could even think about, for example, the car industry and Tesla, where you are buying the car, but you're also buying quite a lot of software. You may be paying a subscription as you're sort of upgrading from one software layer to another. And so we see a very important industry that is sort of moving towards that software as a service model, or car as a service. It hasn't really happened yet in the real estate sector. To some extent, you could see WeWork trying to move in that direction. It just went bankrupt. So people might say, well, so that was a bad idea. I think a lot of people...
I want to say the idea of co-working isn't a bad idea. And maybe you have a different opinion on this, but I am going to just throw in here, even though you're the guest, and it's the problem of the financial model, or maybe that's unfair. Maybe it's more gamesmanship.
I would agree with you. I think as a user of WeWork, and I think many of the people I know who've used it, the general consensus is that it was an amazing service. It is an amazing service to the extent it's still operating, and that the mistakes were done probably in growing way too fast, and in the execution. And sometimes it's not the 1.0 version that succeeds, but the 2.0 version. So I think co-working post WeWork is going to see a massive new wave, and it's going to look a little bit different, but I think it will have a lot of the elements of WeWork. And so I think that's an example of an innovation of housing as a service. I think you look at a hotel chain, and to some extent they're running as a service. And what I mean by housing as a service is, imagine if we could actually consume housing as an experience. And what could that look like? So imagine that my first experience of housing, I may begin by renting, and I'm living in a place, I'm renting. And after a year of renting, the management company says, you've rented for a year, you've been a good customer of ours. We're going to give you 1% equity in the house because we want you to stick around. In fact, if you stay for another year, maybe we'll give you even more. We'll give you another 1.5 points. And we want you to actually build up your equity in this house, even though you've actually not paid any money down. You've just been a good customer. And then I decide I want to move in 3 years to another location. And instead of having to, quote, sell my house and then buy a new house, I could just simply shift my equity from apartment 1 to apartment 2. I've cut through a lot of the very expensive transaction costs that make it very easy for people to get into the property market and to build value that way. And then you could be walking in the community, and you are able to go from, let's say, you rent a bike with your credit card, you swipe in. You rent the bike, you go to a train station, you swipe out, you lock it up in a safe place. You get on the train with the same credit card or the same kind of system without having to sort of figure out a new system. You get on the train and you pick up another bike at the station, and you go up to the university, and it's all seamless. So it's really the notion of how could we design an experience both in the home but also in the broader community that is really low friction, right? If Apple or Amazon were designing that experience, how would they do it? How could we apply many of the learnings and experiences that we have from the best in class practitioners into the most important thing, which is our home and our experience in our surrounding neighborhoods?
Yeah, I love the idea that people of relatively limited means can have the opportunity to start building equity. Which increasingly is just out of reach for people to in some small way to access the personal wealth building that real estate has. Another sort of thing that came to mind as I read this portion of your book is by building a portfolio of locations with different types of housing. You're also building the potential for, in a fully realized knowledge economy, right? Your subscribers, your tenants can opt to spend short periods of time in some of those other locations. And what does that do for the consequences on their creativity and their coming together of people within that network? And what are the other ways that you can couple allowing them easy access to each other's ideas through the use of just simply, digital technology? Again, it's within this network, say over a broader region, or, the eastern seaboard of the United States as an example, making it easy for people to not only gradually own or continue to rent, but have access to some kind of equity, and getting access to ideas, getting access to the people within the network. And as they age, if they stay within that network, access to different types of housing, because as you age and as your family circumstances maybe change, you should be able, especially if you're building equity, imagine that you can keep it, but
Yes.
You can change into different types of housing that meet your needs today, freeing up some of that other space for those that need that particular kind of space.
And I would go even further, right? With new technology, you could even reconfigure real estate space on the fly. So effectively in the morning, it could be a bedroom, and in the afternoon, it could be a living room, sort of a next generation version of the Murphy bed, where you're effectively adapting the real estate to the most valuable use at the time. And as they say, the future may be already here. It's just not evenly distributed, right? So you can look at extreme cases or niche cases and see elements of this housing as a service model. So you can think about timeshares as really a version of what you just described, right? The ability to be moving around in different semi-owned locations where you may own a couple of weeks, but you could also trade those weeks. So some version of that could be applied into more of a year-round experience. You could see a club as a way of having a third place that could be shared. And so you could see a co-working network where wherever you are, maybe there's an office that you can go, and that could be your kind of workplace. And that gives you, as you say, the flexibility to be in a number of different domains. So I think all of that is feasible, and you can see those models already operating, but they're in niches, and they tend to be very limited. So they may be serving the kind of the hotel community is serving sort of people that are moving around, but it doesn't tend to serve longer term residents. Even though in the past we used to have hotels for longer term residents, we actually made many of those illegal. You could look at senior living as doing this, but it does it very expensively and in a way that tends to have people fairly depressed and lacking community. But you could see how you could blend some of those senior living models into more multi-generational communities. So again, part of what I like to do is look back at history and see what are things that worked in the past that maybe we discarded for the wrong reasons, and could we bring them back and do a new 21st century interpretation?
Yeah, there's multiple examples of that throughout the book, both in terms of talking about education models, principally education models and housing models, where some of what we're talking about is drawing from the way things used to be. But even then, it was sort of siloed, as you say. It was non-programmatic. We weren't trying to blend a lot of these concepts together into a single program that people could access and sort of stay within the program over time. And that seems to be the new frontier, right? It's that synthesis.
Exactly. You need synthesis and you need design. I was looking for, I'm reading an interesting book that's going back 100 years and how did people do things in the past. And for example, another thing that's missing today is a combination of transit and house building. So most of the train networks that were built were by definition combined with housing. So effectively part of the cost of the train system was the housing. That's how effectively it got subsidized. We don't do that anymore in the US. But in fact, in Japan and in Hong Kong and many other locations, they're doing that very successfully. So maybe that's something we could think about bringing back. So I think that there are a lot of these interesting ideas out there.
Again, great segue into, I want to touch upon the financial models that underlie it. You have some great examples you talk about. You are steeped from your background in venture capital, and you speak to venture capital being used in some relatively novel ways in the book. Speak to that. Speak to any and all financial models. It's really within the financial models that sometimes we can sort of predict the success of a new or relatively novel project. It needs to be well planned out. No matter how much the other parts of your strategy are well played, we've got to really think about how we fund it.
Absolutely. And I think the good news is that there are vast resources in the financial system that could be deployed into building knowledge towns and knowledge hamlets and knowledge neighborhoods and clusters of these. And I think the opportunity could easily be in the range of $1 trillion in the US, or it could be $10 trillion. It's that big. It could even be bigger than that. And finance and money will go to the projects that have the best risk-adjusted return. Ultimately, they're going to look at what's the return expectation and what's the risk I have to take to that, as well as what is the friction, what is the cost. And so if you want to get things done today in 2023, you're not going to change the structure of the financial institutions today. You have to work within the constraints of what exists. And so one effective way of doing that is to figure out ultimately what's going to pass investment committee. If I want to work with this company, how does the investment committee make decisions today? And then reverse engineer from that to the project that you're trying to do and figure out how could our project fit within their investment committee decision. And it may be that the whole project doesn't, but a part of it does. And so that leads you to another idea, which is capital stacks, where you say, well, I may need to find 5 different partners, and each of them will have one piece of the stack that fits with their investment model. And I'll have to do sort of the conceptual work of breaking it up and making it digestible for each of these financial groups. And I shouldn't expect them to do the work. Similarly, there are vast amounts of government money that's been placed from the federal system into the states. And I think a lot of the states kind of think that the federal system should be sort of figuring out how to allocate it. In reality, there are so many different departments and so many pockets of money that there's no coordination happening at that level. It's really the job of the local people to go and say, there's a bunch of capital stacks. Could I organize my project in such a way that I can tap into some of that financing, which may be lower interest rate, maybe non-dilutive, maybe it's a grant. And could I then match this private capital and that public capital and together orchestrate something that could actually fund a pretty substantial project by working all these pieces? And it's hard work because I'm effectively going to have to figure out all these systems, reverse engineer to them, and then build my own model. But once you've done that, you've made it very easy for them to finance you, and therefore you get your project done. So I think that's kind of effectively a new skill, almost like a financial orchestrator.
It seems to me, coming from the real estate world, right? Financial stacks, it's how almost everything gets done. Unless you're an individual that's just flipping a house one at a time, and even then, you might have 3 to 5 people who are involved in that, right? In relatively small amounts of money. But that in its simplest form, that would be considered some form of financial stack. But
yes,
whether you're using tax credits and you've got some cash, you might use local construction financing, but then using something beyond that for a longer term mortgage as a turnkey project. But what role does venture capital play in this? I'm interested in that only because, and maybe I just need to get over this in my own mind. Venture capital to me is usually you've got teams of innovation-based companies, true startups, right? They're scalable. You've got the real estate world and the various people who want to invest in real estate. A blend of the two, interestingly enough, is the aforementioned WeWork, right? I mean, this was essentially sold to people as we're going to scale this on a size and a rapidity that equals, the startup world, right? What are some ways, though, that venture capital can get involved that it's not already, that would work at this intersection between the innovation side of things and the knowledge economy and the physical spaces in which we need to develop for them to for the two of them together, these main components, to fully activate a community that doesn't have a critical mass of either one?
So it's a complicated question. Today, the worlds of, say, real estate and venture capital, even though they're both kind of in finance at some level, operate as almost completely separate worlds.
Right.
And they don't really see each other. There's a little bit of overlap in what's called prop tech or construction tech, but that's a fairly small niche. I think WeWorks, as you said, tried to some extent blend that in, not successfully. I actually think that a better example is in Vermont is Hula, which has built an amazing co-working space, but it's also become effectively a venture capital fund and location, and is creating both a place-based and a venture-based model integrated into one. And I think that points to possibly the future of what co-working could be doing.
Oh, and it's essentially they're successful because they recognize these are two different businesses and they're running them at an optimal type and level of effort. They're accepted practices, right? They've got plenty of examples they can point to, and they're simply running these two different businesses well, right?
Exactly. And so recognizing that they're different, but that there is adjacency and that there is an inherent synergy between tech and place, and I would add talent. So I think of the three-legged stool: tech, place, talent. And one way to think about it is I need an amazing place to attract the talent to work in the tech. I also need amazing tech and high growth jobs to attract the talent to live in the place.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I'm building a great place, but I don't have enough high growth companies in that surrounding community, that's probably not going to go very far. If I build a place and I find mysteriously a way to get some venture capital without the talent, probably those companies also won't go very far. So I have to sort of simultaneously solve that equation. I want to get the talent, the tech, and the place working more or less in concert. That tends to be easier to do where there's a university, especially a research university, because you are naturally going to have quite a lot of talent. You're going to have some interesting technologies. And that's why universities are natural anchors for knowledge towns. But then the question is, well, what if I don't have that kind of university? How can I do that? And you may have to decide to invest heavily in place and in tech, and then attract the talent. As you've done that, you may have to maybe attract a university to put itself in your location to kind of bring you more of that talent richness. So, for example, Portland in Maine recognized that it wasn't really a typical college town the way a Burlington, Vermont is. And so they have this very interesting collaboration with Northeastern's Rue Institute, which is now bringing a bunch of additional knowledge and professors and students and so on that are kind of imbuing Portland, Maine with more of that vibe. So I think there's some interesting strategies as to how you bring these things together. And I think once you do that, it's a magical combination. And at some point it becomes self-replicating. At some point you don't have to do any more work because the system just fires.
One question I have, because I understand the critical mass surrounding major research institutions, the education institutions that arguably really need the help are numerous small and largely rural colleges, right? It feels as though they're disengaging from the marketplace left and right. What do you say to them?
I would sort of say two things. One is, even most of the major research institutes have not yet built these knowledge ecosystems to the way that, say, an MIT and a Harvard have built around Boston. So many research institutions, I wouldn't take it for granted that they're going to be able to do it. In other words, rather than sort of assuming they're fine, let's just worry on the other locations, I'd say they're going to need a lot of support and great ideas and strategies to make that work. But having said that, that does raise the question, what about these other smaller towns that don't have that strong research university, and what should they be doing? And I think that's where you have to get creative. You may say, well, what do we have? Maybe we have a museum. Maybe we have, for example, in White River Junction in Vermont, there seems to be kind of an interesting design scene emerging.
That's right.
And a comic scene. So there's generally something that you could harness to build upon, and you definitely want to do that. You may find that there is a problem in the world, an emerging new field, where for whatever reason, which could be accidental, you just happen to have kind of somebody that's moved there that's really good at that field, and that could be good enough. Or there's a historical condition, or there's a natural resource that you can access that makes you somewhat distinguished in that area. And then you want to start to build upon that. And then you may want to look around and say, how can I bring more people and more talent that value that unique asset and start to populate my city with the kind of people that will build this knowledge ecosystem? And going back to places like Oxford and Cambridge in England, which are these sort of classical epicenters of the knowledge economy, especially Cambridge. At one time it was just another little rural village in the middle of nowhere, but for whatever reason, people started moving there. It became a university town. Then it was a sleepy university town until about 30 years ago. And then it started to do things like it built an industrial park. It started a venture capital fund. And now it's a $60 billion a year economy, knowledge economy. So many places began with nothing. And I really believe that the answer is there's always a way. You may just have to be more creative depending on your starting situation.
Like any other entrepreneurial activity, creativity, work with what you have, work incrementally, and work consistently to garner the success.
And also, the number of problems that we need to solve are actually growing exponentially, and the market opportunities are growing exponentially, right? So it's not like we're short of markets to go after. And so even if you almost had nothing, you could say, well, let's just go collectively look around the room and see what things do we in this location like to do, and let's get really good at it, and let's figure it out. And the good news is almost every place has good access to data, to technology. I mean, in many ways, ChatGPT and the AI revolution is a great level. It's going to bring effectively the most advanced strategic advice to any person for maybe $20 a month or for zero. So, you could sort of look at the current context and say, well, it's impossible. I'm never going to be able to compete. Or you can say, actually, I've never been in a better position to compete. What's really missing is I'm not challenging myself enough. And I would define an entrepreneur as somebody that's really taken that notion of, I want to give myself the biggest possible challenge I can take and take it. They're answering the call. Those who are not doing it and not necessarily answering the call, if they choose to, I do think they will be able to discover amazing opportunities because they're just out there, especially in the West. I mean, I think if you're talking about maybe a part of the world where they don't have access to electricity and food, and there's a lot of things that are sort of holding people back, or in the US, there are many people that are disenfranchised, right? I'm not saying it's easy for everybody, but those of us that are in a position where we are comfortable, we have access to electricity and power and connectivity and AIs, we shouldn't give ourselves the excuse that it's not possible. We should actually say, how come if I'm fit and I'm able and I don't have a health issue and I don't have somebody I'm taking care of, which are all great things we should be doing if that's our kind of mission. But if I'm in a situation where I have excess time, why shouldn't I challenge myself? And I also think as an individual, you're going to be happier, right? Like, taking on the biggest possible challenge and figuring out how you can get there is a way to actually find purpose and happiness. So do it not for others, do it for yourself.
Happiness through purpose and through living a meaningful life. Not always an easy life, and not without the absence of pain, but that meaningfulness and that purpose leads to true happiness, one would hope.
Yeah, and I think we've forgotten that, and it's very easy to get pulled by other things like possessions and wealth and all the shiny objects out there. But I think as we play around with those, we realize how unsatisfying they are. And then, as you discover, hey, there's a problem that I'm uniquely well suited to solve, and I'm going to start going after it, I think you find a lot of happiness, right? So how do we encourage more people to at least experiment with the idea of doing that and seeing how it works? And if it's too big a problem, you can always throttle down. But my experience is actually you move in the opposite direction, right? You start with something, even if it's big, and you say, actually, it's a lot bigger. I mean, my own experience with the whole sort of knowledge towns process is every time I look at it, I realize the opportunity is getting bigger and the challenge is even greater. And it's a little bit overwhelming, but it's also exciting.
Dominic Endicott. The book is Knowledge Towns, Colleges and Universities as Talent Magnets. Fantastic work that David and you did creating this book. And I want to thank you very much for sharing your ideas with us today.
Thank you. Great questions. And I appreciate the opportunity.
SMG's Are We Here Yet podcast is a production of M the Media Project and SM Graves Associates. Learn more at smgravesassociates.com.